In today's video, we're going to be going over multiple potential East Coast snowstorms as well as colder air that is on the way for the eastern states. Let's go ahead and just dive into things. Now, every single day that I've been making a video for, let's call it the last 3 or 4 days, things have been improving as far as cold and snow are concerned. For the eastern states, it continues to look more and more wintry. So we're going to be diving into that today, comparing the European model with the American GFS model throughout this video. I really hope you enjoy it. Let's dive into things, and we're going to actually just move past today and move into tomorrow, actually, on Saturday, January 27th here. And we do have a low pressure system developing here for northern Alabama into southern Tennessee. Somewhere in that range is where we expect the heart of this low pressure system to be. Very interesting setup. We mentioned this the past couple of videos, but we have a ridge that is really building out west. And we have some cooler air. It's not severe by any means, but it is cold enough, setting up here just to the west of this low. So we have that cold air diving down. We have this low pressure system developing, and right here we could see a freight train of Gulf moisture being infused into this storm system, which is going to help it really gather some intensity throughout its lifetime here. So let's move this towards later on Saturday evening into Sunday, very early morning. This is going to be approximately 4 or 5 a.m. here on Sunday, January 28th, and we see the low is somewhere over eastern Kentucky here. Very classic setup. We have a warm front to the east, cold front underneath, cooler air diving southward to the west of it, and this all just kind of continues to move northeasterly. We already see some snowfall developing here on the very northern extent of Pennsylvania and southern extent of New York. I really like this European solution, and I think that this is going to be pretty spot on. We're going to show you the GFS one in a minute, which I don't agree with quite as much, but we'll dive into it in just a moment. Let's keep going, and we see that this storm really from eastern Kentucky, so what it does is it moves towards eastern Kentucky northward here, and it really begins to just move directly towards the east after this point. And we see this happen oftentimes. A lot of this energy is transferring eastward, and it takes a sharp turn towards the east here. Once it comes off the east coast here, we see pretty rapid development, and for the time being I'm actually going to just zoom us into the east here so we can get a better view. But we see it's over the Delmarva. There is a 999. Once this thing breaks free of the East Coast and is over water, we're going to see more rapid intensification. Again, we see that freight train of moisture still moving from the Gulf of Mexico near Florida all the way up the East Coast, up to the low pressure system. So it's going to continue to pick up steam once it moves offshore. Meanwhile, we have snowfall already developing for northern Ohio there, northern Pennsylvania, southern New York into southern New England here. There will be some mixing issues in lower elevations, especially in coastal regions here of southern New England. It's going to be a pretty messy storm, but if you're in the Catskills, the Adirondacks, the Green Mountains, the Berkshires, the White Mountains here, you're going to do phenomenal. Let's keep going though, and we see that this storm becomes snowier and snowier. We talk about this time and time again, but a big threshold for these storms is once this low is to the east of your area, so we'll just draw a hypothetical line here. Once you're to the west of the low, overall things are really rapidly cooling down for these areas, and that's why we're seeing a lot more snow on the back end of this system, especially for northern Pennsylvania. Again, most of New York, most of Massachusetts, and then southern New Hampshire, Vermont, and portions of Maine here. I think this is very spot on, and really this is what I anticipate to happen. What's interesting is if you watched our video a couple of days ago, we had a high pressure system set up here, and I mentioned that I think it's overdoing it. They oftentimes tend to do that. I thought that that high pressure system was going to weaken, be a little bit further north, and that would allow for this low to really take place further north than what the models were showing at the time. And sure enough, all of that has transpired over time, and that is what this European model is showing at this point. We see that the low, instead of doing our original kind of curve back to the south, is now taking that more straight eastward approach, which is going to give longevity to the snowfall for Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and even Maine here getting involved. Very heavy snowfall in there, and I do expect this to be a pretty massive snowstorm, certainly plowable for most areas. As it slips to the south eventually, much later than we originally anticipated, we continue to see snowfall here for southern New England, and they could pick up some back-end snowfall for areas like Rhode Island, Connecticut, and southern Massachusetts. That could lead towards some snowfall totals after we had a very mixed system for the beginning of it. We could pick up a pure snow event on the back end of things. We're left with pretty decently cold air for all of these areas in here by the time we're reaching here on early Tuesday, January 30th. Let's call it about 2 a.m. things are going to be much, much colder than what we're dealing with right now. It was 80 degrees here in Virginia today. It's hard to believe, but it was so nice, so beautiful, and I hope all of you up and down the East Coast got to enjoy it, this 3-day stretch of very, very nice weather, because it's not going to last forever, I'll tell you that right now. Now, meanwhile, over that course of time, nothing really has transpired out west. That's why I felt pretty comfortable zooming things in. The only thing that's really changed is we've seen this ridge really build up even further, and this is what we call a positive P&A. You've heard me say that repetitively over and over and over again, but it's crucial because it causes a massive ridge out west, which really causes the east to want to balance things out and have a massive trough, and that's what we've seen take place here. I want to keep going with this because we begin to see some interesting activity along the east. The cold air is still around for this area. We have a bit of a low developing off the East Coast and maybe some more snowfall opportunities for next week. This is Wednesday the 31st, and we have a little bit of a mid-Atlantic snowfall special in here taking place a little bit on this model. We see the cold air continue to dive southward all the way into the Carolinas, and a little weak low pressure system trying to develop offshore of North Carolina. I think that there is some potential here. I think there's more potential than this is even indicating. We're going to watch this area closely, especially if you're inland, just like always, but even coastal areas, we can't rule out potential snowfall here. I think that there's a lot of potential in between Wednesday the 31st into February 1st here for a potential snow system around the southeast mid-Atlantic area. Now, all of that kind of takes place, and just like we've kind of been calling for, we see this atmospheric river begin to take place for the west, where we see a barrage of storms taking place for this area. Snowfall in the mountainous regions, rainfall in the lower elevations and coastal regions, definitely going to be active. We can see massive amounts of snowfall taking place. And then by the time we're taking a look at approximately the 3rd here, very early, about 2 a.m. on Saturday the 3rd, we see another low pressure system near the northeast. Cold air still in place for this area, and this does lead to some snowfall perhaps for the northeast, so another system to watch. Meanwhile, again, we see continuous snowy activity out west taking place. We continue to see all of this similar activity taking place, and we really get colder and colder and colder with the pattern. This right here, I mean, it's hard to even explain what's going on here because I don't even fully comprehend it, to be honest with you. We have a very strong jet to the south, pretty unusual to see it that flat, and we see cold air pushing down on both the west, the central, and the eastern states here, and it's really a flat trough across the entire United States. Is this possible? Certainly. I think almost anything in the world is possible. It's just how likely is it is the biggest question. And I have not really seen anything like this in my entire weather career, if you will. So definitely take this with a grain of salt. I think this is an interesting look. Certainly unusual, like I mentioned, but definitely something that I would call lower probability just because of how highly unusual it is. But something like this, I mean, we have a strong jet to the south, clearly moisture moving along this area. We would be watching the entire southeast up the East Coast in this type of a scenario, even the southern plains. We'd be watching for some interesting activity and continuously watching the west. I would say in this type of a scenario, the southwest would be the main area to watch, as most of this moisture would probably be riding along this southern jet. But definitely unusual. Take it with a grain of salt. That's certainly what I'm doing. I don't know how likely this is. I don't think it's very high probability. I would say that for sure. Let's move on to the GFS model. I want to take a look at this upcoming snowstorm. Again, same thing. We have this kind of Gulf moisture being infused, cold air to the west, low is trying to develop, same exact setup. So let's move eastward. Again, there's not going to be a lot of activity before the 1st of February out west. So let's just watch it. And we see that there's a much different solution here. The low is probably about 100 miles further south, a little bit weaker as well. But we see snowfall throughout West Virginia, Maryland, throughout the entire state of Pennsylvania, areas like New Jersey, New York City in there. Still southern New England and southern New York. But everything is about a good 100 miles further south on this solution. I would definitely take this with a grain of salt. I would call this the less likely option. And I hate to see this, the European model and the GFS model really disagreeing here significantly just a couple of days before this storm starts. Definitely prepare for anything, as any model solution is technically possible. But I really, really like what the European model is saying, which again, for reference, is the one that we were taking a look at a moment ago, not this one. So I think a much further north solution than this is going to be the more likely of the two. However, again, anything is possible. And in this scenario, it really slips off the East Coast innocently. We're left with the cold air afterwards, but the storm is just much further south in general, and so is the cold air, which the GFS model, just so you know, is classic for showing things too far to the southeast and actually being incorrect in that ideology. So keep that in mind as well. Now we also get another storm here, just like we saw in the European model, around the 1st of February, the 31st of January into the 1st of February. But no surprise here at all, it's much further south than the European model. We see the mid-Atlantic and southeast really cashing in, whereas the European model had a low much further north, kind of off of New England, giving this area more like a bigger shot at snowfall. So this one I would say is much more possible to do anything because it's further out, so we don't have much certainty. However, again, the GFS model tends to put things a little too far south, so I would still take it with a grain of salt. We get that third storm. Again, no surprise here. It's much further south than what the European model showed. I will say the only thing is that we have a very similar setup up over west. We have great agreement on this from the models, this atmospheric river. There's not as much debate regarding this. It's going to be multiple heavy storms moving through the west over the course of the next 2 weeks, according to all models. So that's definitely a lot higher certainty. We do get a very interesting storm off the east coast here that just kind of lingers, which we do see from time to time. And this is kind of a mid-Atlantic New England special here around the 4th of February. I would still take it with a grain of salt, however. That one hangs around for a very long time and then eventually slides off the coast. Now, around the same time frame that the European model was showing kind of that flatter jet stream trough around the whole nation, I would say it's similar here on the GFS model, but clearly there's more of a trough out west and then a more miniature trough in the east here, which I would say is a much more realistic look with some minor cold air in the east, major cold air in the west, as opposed to basically just major cold air for the entire lower 48, which is the more highly unusual situation. Now, really quickly, we move into a more strong Pacific pattern. Notice how quick everything is moving from west to east across the nation here. That's classic stuff. And also another classic part of this is that straight west to east movement with your jet streams. Again, your kind of freezing line is somewhere in the middle. Very classic. I would say the thing that's unusual about that earlier European model run that we saw was the freezing line was flat, but it was much further south. That's what really made it interesting. So potentially we're going to be watching for more northwest systems moving into the kind of upper Midwest, Ohio Valley area, and eventually into the Northeast, something like this, which is a lot of what we saw in earlier January. So maybe moving back into a similar pattern to that, where our friends in the upper Midwest, Great Lakes, and the Ohio Valley get in on more snowfall, and also the Northeast getting in on more consistent snowfall later on, with less of a threat to your Southeast and Mid-Atlantic areas. Definitely it's there, but the Northeast is really the area that we're watching for the most part. Now, total precipitation, let's just dive into it. We see a lot for the West Coast as that atmospheric river comes through. The Gulf of Mexico, again, is going to be infusing its moisture into a lot of these storms, both in the plains and in the Southeast. So we see above average activity for all of these areas here. Definitely no surprises, and along the lines of what we've been talking about for a while now. Let's move into the total snowfall. We'll zoom into the Northeast in just a moment for that particular storm, rest assured. The West, looking at gargantuan amounts as we see storm after storm berate this area. And I would say the only real thing that is unusual here is the Northeast, which we'll dive into in a moment, like I said. And then on the GFS model as well, I mean, extremely large amounts out west here as well. As we take a zoomed in look to the Northeast, the European model says very far northern Pennsylvania gets in on plowable snowfall. And then a lot of New York State does as well, including the Adirondacks and the Catskills. And then we can tell that coastal New England on the southern side is really having some mixing issues here, which I think is very realistic. And it's more as you get into the hills of central Massachusetts and the Berkshires. That's where you see northern or southern New England really cash in. And then southern Vermont, most of New Hampshire and most of Maine do very well. And that's oftentimes what we do see happen historically. So I have to find this to be a very realistic output, I would say. The GFS model, as you can see, is much further south, showing southern Pennsylvania getting a lot of snowfall, Maryland getting a lot of snowfall, even Virginia and West Virginia cashing in, and then New Jersey, Long Island, New York City, still southern New York, southern New England here, but all of these areas to the north really miss out because this keeps the low much further south, whereas I'll draw the European model in the yellow. The European model is much further north with the low, and that's why we see the heart of the snowfall, more in this area as opposed to the GFSs, which I'll draw again in the black, which is going to be much more like this area. So again, the black is all the GFS model run, the yellow is the European model run, and the yellow one has to be what I'm siding with more than anything. But I think tomorrow's video is going to be very interesting, so I would encourage you to check in, because usually when we're having disagreement this late, I think that we're going to see them really come together either tonight during the 0Z runs or tomorrow during the 12Z runs, which we will have access to both of them by the time we're uploading tomorrow's video. So be sure to tune into that, check in with us, and hopefully we'll have some agreement on these two major models. Be sure to subscribe, as we do upload every single day. You can even hit the bell icon for daily notifications when we upload, so you never miss one. Be sure to like the video if you did enjoy it, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.